Okay, I think we're ready to get going here. Can everybody hear me okay? Everything's so far so good. Great. Okay. Okay, actually. Um, Hello, my name is Stephen Ford. I'm the manager of engagement here at the Allied Arts Council. And this is one of our, if you haven't seen this before, this is one of our professional development sessions under the branding of artwork that we do every month. Um, this particular session is revolving around making murals, how to actually make that happen real world. We have a couple of guests here today, AJ Louden from Edmonton, April Matisz from right here in Southern Alberta, and then we also have Katie Bruce as a representative of Lethbridge Public Art from the City of Lethbridge and also the Allied Arts Council. But a very important thing, obviously, before we get going, land acknowledgements. So just like to recognize that we are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people, the Canadian Plains, and we pay respect to the Blackfoot people, past, present, and future, recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. Also, the home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region number 3. Thing I always like to do when it comes to land acknowledgements, these are words, and that's if we're actually talking about actual tangible meaning of reconciliation, that can only take us so far. So I always, whenever I do these things, I think it's important that we actually, talk about these things. So what can you actually do for something tangible when it comes to reconciliation? So I try and find different examples when we do these things. Really great example for here in our city here. Take some time and maybe consider going for a walk with the folks at Sage Clan. It's a group of people that do a lot of work um, within our city for real issues that are going on. So if we're going to talk about reconciliation, we got to do the work. So that's something, and I'll just leave it at that in that regard for today. Um, uh, Regarding this chat that we're having here today, we will be having a portion at the end for Q&A. So with that, I would ask that if you do have questions, just put them in the chat down below there. Do it that way. I'll moderate kind of at the end. We'll pass the questions along to whoever you have questions for, whether it be AJ, April, or Katie with Lethbridge Public Art. And we'll kind of handle it that way, that rather than we don't know always what's happening in the room or with audio and that kind of stuff. And that way we can kind of have a little bit control of things and just keep this train moving the way that it ought to. Without that, I'm going to get to our first panelist. So that's April Matisz, a very talented artist from right here in Southern Alberta. So I will yield the floor to April, and everyone please, I guess I can't really clap, but or you can at home. You can clap at home or in your own video, but I will throw it to April.
So this is how you applause in sign language. So I like to do that sometimes. Um, Oki natusi ni tasi tak amam zakoi. That is a Blackfoot phrase meaning thank you, hello, thank you to the sun. I'm grateful for another day. And I learned that from my children who learned it in school. So that's just like a really wonderful example of, I think, some meaningful connection and reconciliation. Okay, so I'm just gonna hit share here and start working on sharing a presentation I made. Okay, so I think everyone can see that. Is that right? All right. So I have made one exterior mural in my life, but I've done a few indoor ones. I learned an awful lot, and I will share with you all of the tips and techniques and whatnot that I learned throughout the process. So here, this is the finished mural. It's called Dreaming of Future Ecologies. It's on the side of the Sisters Pub and Grill, directly across from Casa. I think most of you have probably seen it. So this was a mural. It took me just about 3 weeks to do. It was in September of 2021. Um, so the very first thing I did was I made a mock-up of the design I had in mind. And I actually had to physically paint it. There was no way I could just sort of do it digitally, but I painted this. It's it's a pretty large, like, maybe 2 by 3 foot sort of painting. You can see I sort of collaged on elements at the end. There's the clouds, or actually cut pieces of paper to just add some contrast there. But then what I did is I took a photo of it, and the first thing you have to do when you're doing a mural is, once you've made that design, you have to map that image onto the wall. So whether you're doing making a physical painting, drawing, plan, or else you're doing it digitally, regardless, you're going to sort of put it into a computer and turn it into a digital image. Then you have to superimpose it onto a photograph of the wall that you're painting on. Now, your wall might have a natural grid to it, like an existing brick structure, or you can use a doodle grid slash squiggle grid technique in order to help map your image onto the wall. So you have to photograph the wall with the natural grid, or you photograph it after you've made a bunch of sort of squiggles, like the corresponding image shows here. And then what you do is you have to superimpose your image over top of the wall and adjust the scale. And you do that with a reduced sort of opacity so that you can see both of the images at the same time. And then you print off pieces of the wall at your your desired sort of scale, right? So that you can hold that as you're sort of working on the wall. So I'll just kind of run through an example. So here you have a pretend, wall that you're going to paint. You can see that there's a natural grid, so it's actually pretty easy. Here's my painting that I made. I am superimposing it over top of the wall. And when I go to print this out, I'm going to be able to see the natural grid behind, and that's going to help me sort of draw and map on all of the elements here. The other way you do it is something I've never done before, but it's a pretty cool way to do it. Squiggle doodle drawing grid technique. So you make a bunch of squiggles, you like spray paint this or paint it onto the wall. You take a photo, you put that into Photoshop or something like that. You superimpose your image, and then you can use the sort of the squiggles to sort of help guide you as you're drawing on and mapping out your existing image. So when I first started, what I needed to consider was the state of the wall, right? How clean is it? What is the existing sort of paint that's there? Is there paint there, or is it sort of something sort of rawer than that, concrete? What type of paint is on there? I was actually able to ask Sisters Pub and Grill, like, hey, do you know what kind of paint it is? And they had records and they could tell me exactly what it was, which was useful. The color, considering the color of your wall, and if you want to work that into your design, what kind of existing grid structure is there? So for this, you can see that there was a brick, which was a really easy natural grid, so I didn't have to do anything too complicated. You need to consider the scale of the wall. Can I reach it with a ladder, all the spots, or do I need a scaffold? And then thinking about the sort of oddities on the wall, so like there's some electrical conduit, you can kind of see these pipes. So, you wouldn't want to have, if you're doing something like a face, you don't want to have the face right where there's these sort of elements that can potentially distort things quite a lot. And then the other thing to consider, making a mural, it's a very site-specific kind of art practice, right? So you have to kind of consider the surrounding environment. One thing is as you're painting this, you think about your own physical safety, right? This was in a parking lot, so it wasn't too bad, but there are some situations where, you might be like on the side of a curb and there's sort of like natural hazards that are you're gonna be dealing with those a lot. I really wanted to think about sort of certain elements about the area and how I could directly incorporate them into my project. So you'll see the vegetation along the bottom. I really liked how it had this high contrast with that blackness, that black part of the wall. So that was something I had in mind when I was designing my initial image. And then also I was thinking about the black band itself and sort of like, how can I incorporate that into my image as well? one thing that's really important to think about is how low do you want to have your actual image? How how low do you want to paint? It is very difficult to paint really low. So try to make it easy on yourself too. No one's going to be thinking about those bottom, 6 inches or so, considering you might have like a 16-foot wall, right? Materials. So these were some of the materials that I used throughout the process. Chalkboard chalk. This was something that I learned from a mural talk I attended before I painted this mural. Chalkboard chalk is different than sidewalk chalk. Sidewalk chalk, when you go to sort of erase it or paint over it, it can be kind of gummy, I was told. So it was advised to use chalkboard chalk. So that's what I did. I had printed out many pieces of paper of my template. So it ended up being like 8 pieces of paper that, sort of all together made up the whole image. Brushes, rollers, spray paint, it depends what you are going to use to complete your mural. I stuck with brushes throughout the whole project. Tape is something that might be kind of handy if you have hard edges. I had a lot of like trees and boxes for carrying stuff. One thing is, because it's such a large area that you're working on, you're kind of constantly like moving everything. So you want to make sure, like I used an old laundry basket, like just put all of your stuff in there so you're not having to go back and forth all the time and exhaust yourself. Um, Paper towels, a large bucket of water. This was really handy. I just had a huge bucket of water, and anytime I was finished working with the paintbrush, I would just chuck it in the water. All of the paints I use are acrylic based, so they're water soluble. Um, and so, it's pretty easy to just throw them in a big bucket of water and clean it up at the end. Um, Considering what kind of ladders. So here you can see I have a little step stool, and this got me part of the way. And then also something to sort of kneel and sit on. So I had like a milk crate, and I had a sort of a gardener's kneeling pad. Um, so I did as much as I could do first before getting a scaffold. So this was how much work I was able to sort of get done just with that sort of step stool, and before the scaffold came. Um, Here is the scaffold. So scaffolds, like I found this super fun. It was like having like a little jungle gym that I got to climb around on as I painted. It might not be for everyone. You have to consider, how comfortable are you with height, going up and down stairs. There are safety rails around, which helps out a lot. The views were very nice. I worked with Upper Limit Scaffolding, and they were fantastic. They offered me a much reduced rate because I was an artist, and they understood that the budget constraints of an artist are very different than a construction company. So I really appreciated working with them. Um, the other thing to consider was maintaining vertical consistency. So what I mean by that is, I'd started off on the bottom painting that trunk of the tree, right? And then there's 2 more levels in which I'm accessing the same trunk of tree. I had to go from level to level to level to make sure that the color throughout was about the same, so that when the scaffold's removed, you don't see like a choppiness. Um, and part of that is because I did not buy like a brown tinted, a specific color. I bought paints that were already specific colors, and then I mixed them. So it kind of depends what your own process is going to be. Here is what it kind of looks like on scaffold. Like you have, like 3 feet or so to sort of maneuver. It's kind of comfy. You can sit down on the scaffold, and your legs can hang around, and you can swing your legs. And so it's not, you're not quite as bunched up as you are actually when you're painting really low to the ground. And it offered some shade. Here's another kind of view. And here actually is kind of interesting. You can see the texture of the wall. And as you're painting throughout the day, the light changes quite a lot, right? And at some point, that texture can get really distracting and make it quite difficult that you are getting consistent colors that you want. So there was sort of like natural start and end times I found for this, but that was something that was sort of you can only work so long until it's too distracting. Um, there I am at the very top, and you can see in the lower right corner there that that's kind of what my template looked like. I actually, in Photoshop, I also outlined the grid just so that I could be really clear where those bricks were. And you can see one piece of paper kind of had like a section that was maybe like a I don't know, 3 by 4 foot area of wall. Okay. Other things to consider, insurance. If you were painting a mural, you're going to need to get insurance. I went through the cooperators, and it wasn't too expensive in the end. I was able to get a pretty good deal, $150, and I had to sort of answer all of these questions about kinds of materials I was using and my own experience. I think it's a little bit more if you're using maybe spray paints because there is just additional safety hazards. Um, Something else to consider is the temperature. So paint has an optimal temperature in which it applies well to, a surface, and you want to work in that range. If it's too cold, not, I mean, you're going to get too cold if it's too cold, right? Like your hands are just going to not be able to move very well. If anything, the problem will be it's going to be too hot. And one thing is um, the walls can get so hot. And at a certain point, then when you go to brush on, it's like this acrylic paint just sort of dries almost immediately and it can become really gummy. And then nothing would kind of smooth out. You couldn't kind of blend the colors in the way, right? And so at some point it was like, all right, it is too hot to work and my day is done. Um, Wind. So there's not too much you can do about wind in Lethbridge. But one thing that happens is if it's really windy and you're painting, you're going to get a bunch of sand and stuff blowing against the wet paint and getting incorporated into the acrylic, which is really kind of frustrating. I thought I would have more of that problem. I think I noticed it more actually if I had like a jar of open paint. I would notice, oh, there's a bit of debris that kind of blew into there. So I wouldn't notice it on the wall as much, thankfully, because this stuff does dry quite quickly. But make sure to have something that you can sort of cover up your paint cans and whatnot so that you don't have to deal with wind, dumping a bunch of debris into your paint. Sun exposure. I mean, depending on what direction your wall is facing, you're going to have to deal with various amounts of sunlight at certain times of day and whatnot, right? I think mine was pretty good. It was light in the morning and kind of warmed up, and then by the time it got pretty warm out, my wall was it was more in shade, and so it was pretty ideal. Um, Public interactions. So I was doing this on the outside of a pub. Generally, the people going in and out. I was doing this during the day hours, so I wasn't meeting unruly drunken people. If anything, it was just super fun. It was really fun to have people come up and make comments about, what you're doing. Sometimes you'll get people asking, like, oh, one guy asked me if I could paint a giant wolf on the side of his house. Um, I never ended up looking into that, but anyway, who knows? Maybe more work will come from some of your public interactions. Um, Okay, what else? Okay, paint and varnish. So the kind of paint that you choose, it's going to be a very personal decision. For me, I went with Golden Mural paints, and Golden is the only paint company that actually makes specific mural paints. If you just Google Golden Mural paints, you will find a website that has a ton of information, and they're very specific and knowledgeable about their materials, and they have all of the information there. The pros of Golden Mural paints is that it's just really high quality. The colors are amazing. They are mixable, so that means like I was buying like very specific colors. They have a starter pack where you get, I think I can't remember if it's 6 or 8 little sort of cans of paint, and they would be like um, French ultramarine blue and Viridian green. So you can't choose. You can't go to like a paint store and like you would at a paint store and choose your specific kind of green. You have to mix it. But I was comfortable with that because like I painted my actual initial plan using, you know, viridian greens and titanium dioxides and the very colors. So it was pretty easy for me. And I liked that it was mixable because then I was able to have slight variations. Like if you look at the tree here, you can see that it's not just like one solid brown. There's actually like a couple different tones of color in there, right? And the coverage of this stuff was amazing. Like it was I have a fair bit left over. The coverage was so good. I was very impressed. Um the the downsides of it is that it is pre-mixed colors. So some people prefer to have like a color that's already mixed up. That's exactly what they need, the tint that they need. You have to order it from the United States, and that just meant I had to pay some import fees. It is expensive, but I know when I did this project, I was paid very well. I was given a really good budget to do this mural properly. And so investing in like really high quality paints is something that I was determined to do and felt like it was really necessary because you're using public funds to paint this stuff and you want it to last for a long time. So after I'd finished painting all of my wall, I then and again through Golden, I had an isolation coat I purchased, which is basically like a protective layer that seals in all of that acrylic paint. And then after that, I put on a varnish, and this varnish has a UV protection, and so it's going to protect those colors and keep them really light fast. And also, it is kind of an anti-graffiti protection. So if someone did, you know, vandalize the mural, and I got to say, like, this has never happened. I think people are actually quite respectful about not tagging murals. But there is a protocol, and I informed the city about this protocol. You can remove the varnish and you're not going to damage anything underneath because there is that isolation coat, and then you can varnish again. Um, when I did paint on the varnish, I did it with a brush. You have to do it with a brush, not a roller, because you don't want to create bubbles. Uh, it was kind of hard to see where I had painted already. So then when all the scaffold came down at the very end, it was like I had to look up and see the sheen, like, okay, where have I painted? Where haven't I? And then I had to do some touch-ups. But then if you look at this image here, you can kind of see like where the edge of the varnish went, because you can kind of see around the skunks there. It's sort of like a darker black, and then underneath it's sort of like a duller black. And so the darker black is where there is that varnish. So here's a finished mural. This was taken last summer. So it's stood up really well in terms of the color. One cool thing is Sister's Grill put up a couple lights, which I really appreciated. So now you can kind of see it better at night. And one thing that I really like is all of the weeds that sort of poke up at the bottom, like they feel very immersive. And you can kind of see like again that black band that goes throughout the whole wall. The way that this mural sort of the way I tried to sort of incorporate that to keep it you know, try to make it kind of fit into the environment. That was sort of my aim for that. So I think that is it. And I will pass on the baton here and stop sharing.
Thank you so much, April. That was awesome. I've always really loved that piece on the side of Sisters there. So it's nice to actually to meet the person who's responsible for it. It's a great job. Yeah, anybody who came in a little bit later, just a heads up. So we will be doing the Q&A portion at the end of our next speaker. So if you do have questions, I already see one in there. There's just the Q&A at the bottom bar there, and you can put your questions in there, and then we'll address that at the end of everybody's speaking points. So without any further ado, we're going to get our next speaker up. This gentleman's all the way up in Edmonton. Everyone, please give a nice warm welcome to AJ Louden.
Hey, everybody, thanks for having me. I'm going to share just some of my own mural process. I think you'll hear a lot of overlap with April's. There are a few things that a lot of us muralists do in common. And so, yeah, if you hear that overlap, that's maybe just reinforcement that that's probably a good idea. So yeah, I'll jump into things. All right, I'm hoping everyone can see my screen okay. Cool. So for me, one of the first things I think about is the site itself. Like April mentioned, muralism is such a site-specific practice. So you really want to think about the area that you're painting in. Some of the things that I consider from a creative perspective are the sight lines for the mural. So you can see the mural when you're kind of standing up in front of it, but what does it look like from across the street? What does it look like from down an alleyway? So you'll have like a variety of different viewpoints on the mural, and thinking about that can really open up some new creative possibilities when you're designing the work. You also want to consider how much prep the wall needs before art can be painted. Now, this really depends on the project. Some projects you want the mural to last for 15, 20 years. Other times it's not necessarily part of the goal for that project. You might have a wall that is sort of like a rotating canvas. So we have a few of those up here in Edmonton where it's painted more regularly, and longevity is not a key part of the goal. So if longevity isn't a key goal, then prep is a little bit less important. Some of the things I've had to do for prep in the past include like pressure washing a wall or sandblasting a wall to remove old peeling paint. Let's see here. Oops. Yeah, so you can see some peeling paint like this. So obviously whatever you paint is not going to stick to that. So you can use a scraper, or there's some other tools that you can use to remove that old layer of paint. Another thing you want to think about at the site are the tools that you can use to get you to height. So if you're painting a wall that's taller than like 6 or 8 feet, you're going to want to think about a ladder or a scaffold like April showed, or maybe a scissor lift or a boom lift or some other mechanisms to help get you higher up on the wall. If you're going to use a scissor lift or a boom lift for like a really tall wall, you definitely need certification for that, and they can be pretty expensive, but I find they save a lot of time compared to using a scaffold. So this is an image from a wall that I'm working on out in Toronto, and you can see in the center there's a fairly unsteady surface. So it's like the ground slopes up towards the wall. And so this is something that's a bit of just something you need to pay attention to. If you're going to set a ladder up on a surface like that, it needs to be a leaning ladder and not an A-frame ladder. So the A-frame ladder would just tip over. Similar to if you wanted to use a scissor lift for this wall, you can't actually drive the scissor lift across that ground when it's at such a slope. And same with scaffolding, you need to shim the scaffolding up so that it'd be level on a surface like this. So those are just some of the things that you need to think about. They're all solvable problems, but just knowing in advance after visiting the site that this is something you'll have to deal with can be is just helpful. Another thing that I figured I would share is the idea of painting to surface for a mural or painting on panels and having those panels installed after. So I've done a fair amount of both. I prefer to paint direct to surface because I spend less of the budget on these panels. But sometimes if you want your time to be a little bit more flexible, say, then you can paint on panels in the studio. So you can just set those panels up in your studio and then have them installed later. You can install them yourself, or you can have them installed professionally, whatever you're comfortable with. If you do decide to paint on panels, a couple substrates that I can recommend, so a couple types of panels I can recommend, would be an exterior grade wood like MDO or sign ply. And so this is a type of wood that's meant to be mounted outside. So a lot of signage is made out of this sign ply. The surface is quite smooth and it's water resistant. So you don't have to worry about rain or snow or anything damaging that. It takes paint quite well, but I would suggest sanding it before you start to prime this. And so it paints similar to painting on a piece of MDF. It's a really smooth, clean surface to paint on. You can also cut this product by hand. So you can cut it into contour shapes if that's of interest. So you're not stuck to a rectangle. Another thing you can consider is painting on aluminum composite panel. So some of the brand names are Dibond or Alucobond. This you can also cut by hand with a jigsaw, but you can cut it with a CNC too. So you can create a contour mural instead of something that's just trapped inside a rectangle. This product is actually not solid sheet of aluminum. There's a plastic core, and then it's an aluminum face and aluminum backside. And I'd suggest sanding the surface before priming it because it's quite a smooth surface. And you also want to do what's called deburring the edges. So the edges of this product are quite sharp since it's aluminum. So you want to take some high grit sandpaper, so like 80 grit or something like that, and just do a couple strokes along the side of this so that the edges aren't sharp. So when somebody's installing it, or if you're painting it in the studio, it's not like a razor blade against your hand. You definitely want to avoid that. If you're painting direct to surface, the difference between painted and unpainted surfaces is important to consider. So an unpainted surface, you should clean that, prime it before painting it. Like April mentioned, make sure that wall is clean. You're definitely going to need to prime anything that's unpainted, and then you can remove any loose substrate before priming. So if you're working on cinder block or something like that and it hasn't been painted, sometimes some of the mortar will chip out. So that's something you want to avoid. So yeah, the first stage in this mural process to me is that site visit stage and just understanding the space that you're painting in. And really, I'm talking about exterior murals here. Interior murals are a little different. The second stage in my mind is concept development. So coming up with a vision for that specific space. Some of the things that I think about when I'm painting in a location are which communities the artwork is intended to serve. So that could be quite a broad question. But the people who live in that neighborhood are probably the people who are going to see it the most. So just thinking about who lives there and how whatever you're creating might be received. And then thinking about like sort of the main goal of the project. So sometimes murals that I've been involved in are really about community engagement, and it's more important to get the community together for an event to paint a mural than it is important that the final result looks a certain way or has a certain level of finish. So just thinking about that is really valuable too, thinking about that process in a way that maybe it's important that the process is inclusive. And then the last one here is representation. So oftentimes when you're painting murals that involve figures or humans, those humans might not just be self-portraits. And so just thinking about who you're painting, there's this phrase like nothing about us without us. So if you're painting people of color, for example, making sure that you do some consultation or research or find some points of connection with members of that community to make sure that if you're telling someone else's story, you're telling it in a way that's authentic and rooted in the history and sort of story of that community. So the next stage, sort of after concept development, is image transfer. But one other thing that comes up for me that's sort of like an opportunity when developing a concept for a mural that might not come up as easily with smaller works is thinking about how the mural reads from a variety of distances. So this is a mural I painted in downtown Edmonton, and it's a mural that you can see from quite far away. Like you can be like 5 or 6 blocks away and still see the art piece. So when we came up with the concept for this, we were really thinking about what you'd see, what would sort of like resolve visually from far away, and then what you'd be rewarded with within the mural for coming up closer and taking a closer look. So you can kind of pack some smaller details into a piece like this that just sort of give people like the feeling of a surprise when they come up and see something that was maybe a little bit unexpected. So this one from far away and then closer up. And so I'll go back one slide. So far away, you can see that there's some purple clustered shapes. And then closer up, each one of those shapes is full of details and telling a story about the people that live and work inside that building. So just a bit of a kind of a capture of the painting side of the mural process. So you want to come up with the sketch. You want to transfer that sketch to the wall. You want to block in sections of that sketch and then detail those sections. And then you want to think about the finish, so applying any final protective coatings, whether they're for UV or protection from any kind of like vandalism or physical damage. And then documentation. And when I'm writing a budget for a mural project, I always include documentation because I think that's such an important part of the process to make sure that you can capture both the final piece, but also if you can capture the process, I think that's a really great idea too. So I wanted to show some examples of one way to transfer an image to a wall. And so April mentioned this as well. This is called a doodle grid. And so one of the things that's great about the doodle grid is it doesn't really require a ton of like high-tech methods. You need Photoshop or Procreate or some other image-based software that allows you to layer 2 images over one another. I think April did a great job of showing this. And you need to be able to make the image that's on top a little bit transparent so that you can see the wall behind. So what I did for this doodle grid, you'll see the mural that I'm painting. This one's down in Lethbridge, but you'll see the mural that I'm painting at the end of this. but I created this geometric Art Deco inspired frame, and I used a chalk line from the hardware store to snap all of these straight lines. Then I did the doodle grid technique in this middle diamond shape, because that's where I had all the detailed figure work that I needed to really get right. I basically, for the doodle grid, you can like write whatever you want. It's called a doodle grid because you just do these like random lines and sketches. A few of the things when using the doodle grid method that I've found really helpful are using clean lines of fairly consistent line weight, so that you don't have like some lines that are like 4 or 5 times as thick as other lines. It just starts to get a little confusing. I try to do everything in fairly high contrast so that when you put an image over top of this and then there's a transparent image over top of this, you don't just lose the doodle grid behind it. So having that contrast is valuable. If you look at the image I have on screen right now and you look towards the bottom of it, you can see that I started sketching out in a lighter gray at first, and it wasn't quite dark enough. So I actually went over my own doodle grid with a darker gray to be able to get that contrast that I needed. So that's an important step there, making sure that you have enough contrast. So here's me starting to transfer the image onto the wall. One of the other things I find really valuable with a doodle grid is actually transferring a line drawing instead of your full color mural image. The reason is that if you try to make a full color image transparent over the doodle grid, it's really easy to sort of get lost between the colors and the shapes. So if I just transfer a line drawing, then I can just trace that line drawing out. I know where each line is in relation to the doodle grid, and I'm not sort of like lost in the colors or gradations or any other value changes in the piece. And I'll always use a contrasting color when I'm tracing compared to the color I've used for the doodle grid. So here you can see I use some gray for the doodle grid, and I use some bright blue for the outline that I'm tracing onto the artwork. So that was important for me too, again, just to stop me from going crazy and just be able to make sure I know what I'm doing and can kind of track my work a little bit more easily. So you can see I've kind of like filled in, I traced out the figures. Those were the most detailed, important sections that I really was using the doodle grid for. And then I filled in the colors in the background. So that doodle grid kind of disappears pretty quickly. And then this is the final mural. And so the doodle grid was really helpful for me to transfer the figures at scale in proportion without having to sketch and resketch them. So that was a really helpful part of this process. And all the work that I've shown so far, all the work that I'll show is done pretty much entirely with spray paint. Sometimes I'll use some roller paint to fill in a background element when I'm blocking in. But I love spray paint. That's kind of my primary medium. So I use that for most of my work. I have done some murals with brushes as well, and brushes work great too. One of the things I find an advantage with spray paint on a surface like this, you can see this stucco surface is like quite textured. So by using spray paint, I'm able to fill in all of those gaps and cracks and little inconsistent areas more easily than I'd be able to do with a brush. So it was the right fit for this surface in particular. So another thing, just a bit of technical info, what type of paint that I use for murals. I use acrylic paint, often called house paint, quite a lot. And I always make sure I'm using exterior grade house paint when I'm painting an exterior mural. It's quite cost effective for covering large areas. You can custom mix colors to match whatever you have in mind, or you can choose them from the manufacturer's palette. So you can get a color book that's quite thick from like Benjamin Moore or somebody like that. I often go in with my spray paint color book and ask them to match a color of spray paint that I plan on using, so that when I spray paint over top of the latex paint in the background, those colors will match. So that's something I do quite a bit. You can roll this acrylic house paint on. It used to be called latex paint, but it's acrylic paint now. You can roll it on, you can brush it on, or you can use a paint sprayer. And this is something I use quite a lot as well. A paint sprayer is something you can rent. And with the paint sprayer, you can get different tips onto the spray gun. And the different tips allow you to fill different amounts of area. You can use like a certain tip to fill in a detailed section with the spray gun and use another tip to fill like a lot of area at once. So it's a pretty flexible tool. They do require a lot of cleaning, and they take a lot of water to run too, because you have to run a lot of water through them. The Graco actually makes like a small handheld version that holds about a quart of paint. And that's great to use on a lift as well. So it's a little battery-powered handheld spray gun. And so I love those. Those are really handy. I don't use the acrylic paint that you buy in tubes from the art stores. They just tend not to be cost effective enough, and you end up mixing them down to a more liquid consistency anyway. So those haven't worked well for me in the past. I don't use oil paint for murals at all. But if you wanted to use some oil paint, I mean, technically it's possible. You should, of course, layer it on top of acrylic paint and not below. Some people have asked before about other media like watercolor, gouache, student grade acrylic, wax pencils, and ink markers. Generally, those aren't light fast enough to be suitable for outdoor murals, so I wouldn't suggest any of those. When you're buying spray paint, you can get stuff from the hardware store, but it's not going to be very light fast. So I tend to use artist grade spray paint. The brand that I use the most is called Belton Molotov, but there's also two brands called Montana. It's confusing, but there's two different brands, both called Montana, and those are really good too. If you varnish them properly, they're quite light fast as well. I haven't tried the mural paint from Golden, but it sounds interesting. It's definitely something I'd be into trying. So that could be a good option for you as well. One of the things that you can do with house paint is buy two colors that you're planning on using and mix them. Just a bit of a heads up that they use a different pigment system than Golden paints or some of the other art store paints that you might be used to. So they tend to muddy a little bit more quickly. And so just your results are going to be, will just vary a little bit. So if you mix a certain yellow and a certain green and you're expecting a certain color out of that, you might have to do a bit of experimentation to reach that outcome. Because again, the house paint mixes a little bit differently than the paint that you get from an art store. Some of the tools that I use in my own process, brushes and rollers. Rollers come in different pile thicknesses. And so a thicker pile roller is better for a wall that's like a little bit rougher in texture. So that's something you'll want to consider. The brushes also and rollers will vary in quality. And so foam rollers tend not to be the best fit unless you have a really super smooth wall. Paint sprayers, like I mentioned, are great. For the paint sprayers that are like the large scale ones that roll on the ground, you'll both need a compressor and a power source. So just making sure that you can plug in for those are good. They're great because they apply paint really quickly. You can also use lifts and ladders and scaffolding, which I think we've kind of chatted about before. You can rent scaffolding from places like Home Depot. One of the things is that you need to set it up yourself. So like that'll take a little bit of learning. Hiring a scaffolding company is a great idea, especially if you have any kind of complex ground that you're working on. So in that image that I showed earlier in the presentation where there's a slope up towards the wall, it would be a great idea to get a scaffolding company to come and install the scaffolding for a site like that so that it's up there safely. And what they'll do is create base plates for the back legs and then creates a shim system so that the scaffolding is level up at the wall. But if you can make that somebody else's problem, that's a good idea. Some of the PPE that you'd want to use too, some of that personal protective equipment would be like a fall arrest harness if you're using a lift, a respirator if you're spraying paint at all, and then gloves and skin protection because you don't want to be like bathing in paint for too long. None of the paint that we use has lead or anything in it like that, but it's still like just not great for you. One of the other things to think about is the placement of your mural on the wall. So like April mentioned earlier, you don't necessarily need to paint right to the ground. I find from the ground up about a foot is it's an area that gets like a lot of, it kind of gets damaged a little bit more easily than the other parts of the mural, just because like you have stuff like snow freezing and thawing right up against the wall. Maybe you're in a parking lot like April's mural was, and you might get some gravel or dirt spray from cars like turning around in the parking lot, and that tends to land a little bit lower on the mural. So just thinking about that can be helpful. If weather is an issue, if you get a lot of rain, you might want to put a drip cap on the top of the mural. So this isn't something I've done a lot of, but it can help if you're getting like lines of water pouring through like one section of the wall. It can start to wear that section a little bit more than the other sections of the mural. So that can be an issue. So you can put a drip cap above. And then when you're clear coating your mural, once you're finished painting, you want to consider an isolation coat. So GAC 100 is a product from Golden that you can use. And this is used to isolate the finished artwork from any other protective coatings that you put on. And then there's two types of top coats that you can put on that protect the mural from physical damage, like vandalism or anything like that. One type is a sacrificial coat. And so this is similar to what April described, where if somebody damages the mural or if the mural is damaged in some way, you can remove the damage and then you can reapply this coat. You need to reapply the sacrificial coat anytime any damage occurs. There are also non-sacrificial coats. And so this is a permanent coat, meaning that the mural can't be replaced or updated very easily. These are generally epoxy-based. They're pretty nasty chemicals. It's usually like two parts that you mix at once. These do work well because you can just pressure wash the mural anytime that it gets damaged. You don't need to reapply anything. You just pressure wash it with water. You can wash the damage off easily. These non-sacrificial coats are quite expensive, and you really need to have a building owner who's on board because you're kind of locking in the mural for the next few decades or next decade at least. Because to remove this non-sacrificial coat, you have to like sandblast it off the wall because it's like an epoxy coating. And then for cleaning, usually you shouldn't have to do too much cleaning, even for an outdoor mural. Sometimes if you get like some salt buildup or like a lot of like spray from a parking lot, that might appear near the bottom of a mural, and you can just wash it off generally with a hose, not even with a pressure washer. If you do need to wipe anything off a mural, I'd suggest using like a microfiber cloth and just some warm water with a small amount of soap. Couple other things to consider around, I just wanted to jump back to this slide, around temporary murals. So one of the things that I've witnessed is that there are like a lot of people that are really excited about painting murals, and there aren't many opportunities for people who are just beginning to get into murals. So one option is just building a temporary mural wall, and this is something I do for a lot of workshops. So just building like a small 8 foot wide by 6 foot tall wall. You can use dye bond or any kind of plywood, and creating a structure that you can use to practice or have other community members practice on. That can be like a really valuable way to learn how to scale this type of image making up. A few of the challenges that I find people deal with when going from painting smaller scale work up to painting murals. One is that transferring of the image. So transferring an image through a doodle grid or maybe using a projector or anything like that to transfer the image. So once you have that figured out, you're kind of off to the races. But another challenge is which tools to use to achieve the effects that you can achieve on a smaller scale. So like mural painting brushes, you need like a much bigger brush often. Or if you're doing a lot of like bold line work, like for me, if I was painting a smaller piece, I'd use like a number 2 round. How do you scale that tool up? What's the large, big mural wall version of that? So just thinking about that and working through that at a small scale on a temporary project where there's maybe a little bit less pressure can be a really good idea too. Cool. So that's pretty much it from me. I'm happy to jump into the Q&A next, I think.
All right, thank you so much, AJ. Yeah, so I'm just gonna bring the spotlights to bring everybody in here. So yeah, so now we'll open up the floor for questions. We do have one already here in the Q&A, so I'll just bring that up here. Valerie is asking, I believe this was from April's talk, what exactly is the isolation coat? Please clarify.
Okay, so I think AJ kind of explained this as well. I'll sort of tell you exactly what it says on the Golden Paints website. So the isolation coat, it's a permanent, clear, glossy acrylic layer that will even out the absorbency and sheen of the mural surface, which is really nice. Like that means, it's all going to have the consistent sort of sheen. And then that allows for application of the mural varnish. And so that isolation coat, it acts as a permanent barrier to protect the mural against damage if the varnish ever needs to be removed. So as far as I know, unless you're sandblasting, you can't get to the sort of paint that's behind the isolation coat. But you can remove whatever is added on top of the isolation coat. So I hope that helps clarify that.
Awesome. Thank you, April. Also, if anybody doesn't feel like doing the typing thing and just wants to try the talking, we can do that. Just raise your hand and then we'll get to you. Next question we have, do you have an image of a temporary wall? I don't know if that's temporary. Does anyone have an image of a temporary wall?
Yeah, I can share an image of a temporary wall for sure. I will just share a diagram of what they look like. Just give me 2 seconds to hunt that down and I'll share.
I thought it was temporary wall, but I wasn't entirely sure. So thank you, Valerie.
Temporary walls are quite common in like larger city centers. I know that there's quite a few throughout some of the larger spaces in the States, like Houston, LA, and they're really used kind of for practicing, right? So it's a wall that continues to just kind of get painted over top of.
I think you're muted there, AJ.
Thank you. So I'm not sure if you'll be able to read the text on here very easily. You can use sign panels for these mural walls, or if you're just planning on having them up for a couple of days, you can use OSB. So OSB is oriented strand board. It's pretty much the cheapest plywood you can get at the hardware store. I usually use the 3/8 thickness because you don't need it to be very thick. And I build these 16 feet wide because it gives you a good section of mural, and I build them just over 5 feet tall. So you can really build them as tall as you want. I build these for workshops with youth so that most people are able to reach most parts of the mural wall. Thinking about how to make it stand up is helpful too. So you can see in the bottom right corner here, there's just a diagram of a simple setup to put some legs on it. You can also just mount OSB to like a fence or something like that and use that as a mural wall too. But this is like a simple temporary mural wall. These would cost you couple $100 max to create. Usually a sheet of OSB is like $30 or something like that. And then you just need some 2x4s.
Awesome. I know you went into it a little bit in terms of the just dealing with the elements when you're doing the murals and that. Can you speak any more on that, like any sort of challenges that you've had dealing with the elements while making a mural?
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. Few to consider. April mentioned wind. So for me, somebody using a lot of spray paint, wind is like worse than almost anything. It's really annoying. For me, I usually just like get a little closer to the wall, or if there've been times where I'll set up a temporary wind shield. So if I have a spare sheet of plywood or something like that, and I can find a way to stick it up perpendicular to the wall, it can block some of the wind that's traveling along that surface of the wall and kind of help me out. Another thing to think about when you're looking at the site of a mural is thinking which direction the wall faces. And so I knew I only had 20 minutes. So I didn't want to go too deep in the weeds on any one of these sections, but thinking about which direction your final mural wall faces. So if you have a south-facing wall, sun exposure is going to be a major factor because the wall is going to be lit for most of the time that you're painting, most likely. And it's also going to get a lot of sun throughout the year. So you're really going to want to think about UV protection in a big way, especially in southern Alberta. So that would be one thing. April mentioned the sort of optimal temperature range that you can use liquid paint in. So if you're using any kind of like acrylic paint, generally it's about 10 degrees, like plus 10 to about plus 30. Even at a plus 25, if you're getting a lot of direct sunlight and there's not much wind or air movement at all, the paint can get quite gummy really quickly. So you need to think about keeping the paint in shade and not having all your paint out at once. So that can be something that's helpful too. Rain can be a bit of a headache as well. So if you have a lot of predicted rain for the week that you're supposed to paint a mural, you might want to set up a tarp above the mural that causes the rain to drip out behind you. With spray paint, it dries quite quickly, so more quickly than anything that you would put on with a brush. So with spray paint, if there's like a light drizzle, I can still paint, but if it's really raining and coming down, then I need to stop painting. Even the direction of the rain can matter. So sometimes I'm painting on a building and it's raining, but I'm barely getting wet because the direction of the rain is kind of like just hitting the roof and then kind of passing the building, if that makes much sense. So if I'm painting on the south face of the building and the rain is coming at me from the north, I might actually be okay. So that's another thing to think of. Yeah, those would be a few of the big ones in terms of weather that come to mind for me.
AJ, can I just ask a quick question about how long? So we heard from April, she gave us kind of like a really good rundown of how long it took her to paint that mural. When you were working with the boom lift, how long did that mural take for you to finish, the one in Lethbridge?
The one in Lethbridge, I think we painted over, it was about a week. And so the boom lift is great because you don't have to do a lot of like climbing. And so just in terms of like how much energy you wake up with in the day, if half of that is spent climbing up and down the scaffold, then that might not be the best. But the boom lift is also quite expensive. So you kind of just have to weigh those two options. When I painted the piece in Lethbridge, I also had lots of like previous outdoor painting experience. And so I knew sort of like there wasn't a lot of guessing in terms of translating the image to scale. So that was helpful too, versus like my first few murals that were like a lot bigger took me way longer. So that's going to be a major factor too. Yeah, hopefully that helps answer that question.
I have a question, and maybe this one might actually be for Katie or for anyone. But just some of the expectations in terms of the costs associated with like preparing that wall and cleaning it. So, because I'm just like so it should be, I imagine, the business being a little bit responsible for preparing that wall for you folks to do the mural on it. Am I correct in that assumption?
Yeah, especially if it's just like sort of um, the surface detailing is the responsibility for our program, for the business owners to take care of. So in terms of if there needs to be any sort of cleaning that has to happen, they need to organize that ahead of time. So that's sort of part of the scheduling shuffle that takes place once we actually have contracts signed, figuring out sort of when the artist would like to come, when the prep work needs to be taken care of on the wall. I think most of the surfaces this go round will be on walls that have already had paint on them. I think there's only maybe one or two that will need to be primed ahead of time. And so that will be something that we'll be talking with the artist specifically about.
Great. Is there any? Oh, we have another question in the chat here. Valerie is asking, can we take a deep dive of funding and what are good avenues to source for funding?
So I can kind of leap on some of that. So our program is run through a Percent for Art program with the City of Lethbridge. So 1% of capital improvement projects are put towards public art. And so we already have sort of funding kind of in place that we're able to access. Within that, we also work with the Public Art Committee and City Council to kind of help determine how much is going to be set aside for certain sorts of projects. So that would kind of be the primary mode through a capital P, capital A public art program, one that is dealing sort of explicitly with a city. AJ, have you ever worked on a mural that is maybe more of a private funded source?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I've worked on some like privately funded projects. These are mostly commercial murals for small businesses or things like that. In that case, the business generally funds the mural entirely out of pocket. I've also worked on grant-funded murals, and so some of the granting bodies that I've worked with are the Canada Council for the Arts, the Alberta Foundation for the Arts. Both of those have pretty intensive grant processes, so it takes a lot of time to apply for those types of projects. But you do get paid really fairly. You kind of get paid for what you ask for. I've found hiring grant writers to be a really helpful way to sort of like work through some of that. Yeah, those have been two of the other funding sources. I've also painted lots of murals with like schools and other educational institutions, and they have their own funding sources as well. So sometimes they'll be funded through like a parent council or something like that. And so that could be a good avenue to pursue too.
Awesome. That's great. Final last call for any questions. Raise your hand if you're interested. We'll give it 5, 4, 3. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, AJ and April and Katie, for participating in this. It was great. That was very, very interesting, and I have an immense amount of respect for you guys and the work that you've done. It really changes the whole what downtown feels like, not just looks like, but what it feels like. And I thank you for that. So thanks for all the great work. Thank you for everyone for attending. Thank you for Katie for all the great work that you're doing with Lethbridge Public Art. Next artwork session will be May the 30th. Will definitely be online. There might be an in-person portion as well. We're going to have Jillian Gwartz doing a talk on basically taking an idea of she's deals with comic books and children's books and that, taking the idea and going through that whole process into publication. So it's going to be really interesting talk with her. She's incredibly talented. Really looking forward to that. So that'll be May the 30th. These artworks going forward, the professional development sessions will be on the last Thursday of every month going forward at about 7 o'clock. So looking forward to hopefully seeing some folks again. And once again, thank you so much. We'll talk to you all soon.